Um, I'm Professor Mina Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and the Director of the Peter S. Calico Center for the Study of the American Presidency in the Calico School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs at Hofstra. And I'm delighted to welcome you here today for our program, American Constitutionalism at 250, How Will the Past Inform the Future? We have a full day of events. Some of you have been to some or all of the events so far, which we appreciate your enthusiastic attention and participation. We are recognizing the semi-quincentennial of the Declaration of Independence this year with a series of discussions, panels, examining questions of American rights, priorities, principles, and how they are engaged or practiced or challenged today. Today's the panel in this period. I'm delighted to turn over the floor in just a moment to my colleague, Dr. Andrea Libresco, who will introduce our distinguished panelists. I would like to thank Dr. Libresco has an enthusiastic class, and she deserves the applause, so let's give it to her. It was Dr. Libresco who organized this most timely panel, No Kings, 1776 to 2026, Whatever Happened to Separation of Powers? And the panel will fill us in on that. So let me turn it over to Dr. Libresco.
Thanks very much to Mina Bose for organizing the Uber Day. I appreciate that. And also thanks to our many friends in the Cultural Center who make everything possible at Hofstra, including this day. So I appreciate that. I am indeed Andrea Libresco. I'm a professor of social studies in the School of Ed over in Hagedorn. Come visit us, everyone. It's not too far. And I'm also director of the minor in civic engagement and of the Institute for Peace Studies on this side of campus, and I value all of those roles. And I'd like to welcome you to this session as part of this 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. This panel, besides being sponsored by Calico, is also co-sponsored by the CCE, the Center for Civic Engagement, which offers a lot of programs throughout the year, including things like Indigenous Peoples Day and Day of Dialogue, Global Justice Day, Earth Day, voter registration, and more. And it also has, for those of you interested in thinking about this, it also has civic engagement fellows who get paid as part of their jobs to educate themselves, become aware, make their campus aware, and work with community partners as well. So it's a great gig as part of one's job as somebody who needs to make money for college, but part of one's job as a citizen as well. So I urge you to get involved. One more kind of announcement, which is that there are 3 really interesting related courses offered this fall. One is the Intro to Civic Engagement. It's usually offered only in the spring, but it's being offered in the fall as well. The Intro to Peace and Conflict Studies you should check out as well. And there's also a course that's a 1-credit course that kind of keeps you up on current conflicts, current things going on in the world in the fall. So all of which are possibilities for anybody in this audience or any of your pals or colleagues. Okay. The format of this session is going to be as follows. After I introduce the topic and the panelists, and I'm going to introduce them right before each one of them speaks, so we'll remember who they are. They're going to speak for about 15 minutes each, and then it'll be your turn to come up to the microphones. It may be that they have questions for each other as well afterwards, but we'll keep those fairly minimal, so we'll give you the bulk of the time to ask questions. And before I do that, I do want to direct your attention to a couple of slides so you can see what the slide is up right now. These particular slides I'm going to show are from the most recent No Kings rally in Nassau County that I should say was organized by a former student of Hofstra here. So Hallie Brenner-Perlis was one of the organizers of that. And I went to that rally and took these pictures. almost everyone's from this. One or two people sent me them from other places. You'll see one from Boston. But some of us have attended these kind of events, and not necessarily, I just want to be clear that a lot of these events are not particularly partisan. Some are, but some are not. And the reason some are not is because the people who come care deeply about the way government runs and the Constitution runs, and regardless of who's president, want not to have a king, but more of a president who is responsive to the people and a Congress that does its job. So some partisan, some not. I have to say that you'll see the signs in a second, but they're, on the one hand, very gratifying for a social studies teacher like myself, in that they all reference things in the Constitution. And it's always nice that people are calling on their Constitution. On the other hand, it says something really serious about where we are on this 250th anniversary of one of our founding documents. So here we go. There's a few of the signs. The Boston one I got from a friend in Boston, obviously. But you can see that they are referencing no kings, rejecting kings since 1776. In the old world, the king's the law. In the new world, the law is king. Tom Paine. Due process. Where laws end, tyranny begins. Due process. Hands off the Constitution. And there is the Constitution's preamble. No kings. The only king I want is B.B. King or Martin Luther King. I thought these were pretty clever. And then referencing Congress, not just the president. Congress, find your spine. And if you were in the session before this, you know that Congress is not really finding its spine a lot of the time on foreign policy issues. And if you can see that other one, the eggs are expensive. Okay, I have to get closer to see it. Because all the chickens are in Congress. There you go. And then the last one, I'll leave up. We dumped tea in a harbor for less. Again, referencing what caused not wanting kings. And you can see the political cartoon of a huge executive with only teeny tiny little branches on the other end. And I think a lot of people remember these diagrams from their 11th grade American history class. And maybe you were not even that interested when you saw these diagrams the first time around, but it turns out they're very important, and people are calling them back today. So without further ado, let me introduce our first panelist, my colleague David Green. He's a professor of political science here at Hofstra, and he teaches comparative politics, international relations, and American politics, including courses related to political psychology, political ideology, the UN, international organizations. And like all of the panelists here, as you'll hear, he's also active outside the world of academia. He's a frequent contributor of political commentary to various radio outlets and electronic and print journals. David Green.
Hi, everybody. Thank you to my friend and colleague, Andrea, for inviting me to be on this panel. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to my colleagues on the panel. I think we're all excited to talk to you, share our thoughts, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts in response. I think we're going to come at this a little differently, each of the three of us. My task is to look at this question of separation of powers from the perspective of going back to some basic fundamentals and asking some kind of key conceptual questions. I'd like to start with a couple of analogies. Imagine you're a big football team fan. You have a team you're really excited about. They're going into a big game against another team. That team is very much equal to yours. It's equally talented. It has equal resources. The only difference between the two teams is management style. The other team has a head coach who makes all the decisions, and everyone underneath the coach immediately and unquestioningly executes those orders. Now, for your team, you have a choice. You could have the same thing for your team, or you could have a management style where you have multiple different decision makers, each of them simultaneously calling plays, each of them constantly conflicting with each other in the instructions that they give to players, sometimes entering into protracted compromise negotiations to get something done, and continually getting penalized for delay of game as they negotiate. My question for you is, which of those two management style choices do you think would better ensure that your beloved team is victorious? Let's try the same thing. We'll ratchet up the stakes a little bit now. Consider a similar question here. Let's imagine you have a nice chunk of money and you're going to invest it, but you can only put it in one of two companies. Again, both companies are equal in every respect except for their management approach. The first one is run by a CEO who makes all the decisions, moves very expeditiously forward, executing those choices. For the second company, there are multiple decision makers. They often don't agree. The company is often unable to make decisions and move in one direction or another, can't react to market-changing conditions, can't provide attractive product to their customers. So again, my question is, you have this chunk of money, you'd like to double it, you certainly like to not lose it. Which one of those companies is best able to serve your interests? Finally, same concept, now we'll really ratchet up the stakes. Let's imagine there are two countries and they hate each other and they're about to go to war. In fact, the bitterness between the two countries is so deep that this will be a total war. And the army that loses this war will be unable to protect that country's citizens, and the winning army will annihilate those civilians. And that includes, by the way, yourself. So you have very much a large stake in the outcome of this conflict, right? Now, again, the countries are equally powerful in every respect. They're equal in every respect except for the ways that their militaries are managed. In one country, you have a military chief of staff who makes all decisions, and these are immediately and efficiently executed by a very hierarchical structure of officers and troops below the chief of staff. In the other country, the military is often ineffective and slow to move because all decisions have to be unanimously agreed to by a series of various officials and committees. And not only do they find it hard to agree on the best military strategies and tactics, but they often fight for choices that are more about advancing their sort of local interests. Maybe the Navy wants to do something that's good for the Navy and the Air Force wants the same thing, rather than trying to necessarily win the war. So let me ask you the same question as before, only now with your very life on the line. Which country would you rather be in? Which army do you think is most able to save your life? I ask all these questions because if you've grown up in America, you've likely been hearing about separation of powers and checks and balances most all of your life. And you may have come to believe that not only is this the best system of government, it is in fact synonymous with democracy. In other words, no separation of powers, no checks and balances, no democracy. But if you step back for a minute and you think about it, that actually isn't the case, and it actually doesn't even make a lot of sense. Imagine, if you will, that a Martian and a political scientist walk into a bar. And the Martian asks the political scientist, how does your system of government work? And the political scientist says, oh yeah, well, we break it into pieces and there's no sort of clear decision-making authority. And the Martian says, that's interesting. I suppose those pieces are meant to kind of coordinate amicably amongst themselves. And the political scientist responds, well, no, actually, we purposely set those pieces of our own government into conflict with each other. At this point, the Martian is pretty confused, right? And likewise, I think you could see that not only is there nothing natural or given about the American constitutional system, but in fact, it is, at least in the abstract, rather an unnatural configuration. If you think about the analogies that we just considered, it would be quite natural to argue that this business of separation of powers and this business of checks and balances is actually a prescription for failure. Nor is it synonymous with democracy either. The essence of the American model is that power is diffuse, it's spread out. The essence of a parliamentary system, on the other hand, is that power is concentrated. In fact, political scientists sometimes describe the institution of the British Prime Minister as an elected dictator, and they do that for good reason. There are effectively no checks and balances on that position, and there are no separate branches of government. But would any of us in this room seriously argue that Britain is not a democracy? I don't think so. So all of this is sort of a long-winded way of saying that separation of powers is, first, not the only way to structure a government. Second, not the natural way one would likely approach structuring a government in the abstract. Third, not the choice anyone would make if they were looking for maximal efficiency and effectiveness of government. And fourth, irrelevant to the question of whether the system that you create is a democracy or not. All of that begs the question, why did the founders make this, what now appears, to my eyes at least, to be a strange choice? Especially because they didn't have a precedent for this. They had to invent this model. They couldn't just go out and find it in the world. They had to think about it and actually do the work of creation. The answer to that question, why did they do this, is that they were trying to strike a balance on the question of concentration of power. They were trying to strike a balance in between two extremes that they had recently experienced themselves firsthand, both of which were intolerably bad choices. They had launched a war in order to escape the vice grip of an autocratic monarch, King George III. Power was too deeply concentrated under the monarchy, such that the king had largely unlimited power, which could be used capriciously. And the generation of the founders hated that so much that they eventually overcame their conservative respect for stasis and reluctantly launched a revolution. In place of the monarchy, they then created their own form of government under the Articles of Confederation. And as might be expected, they overreacted to the suffocating concentration of power that they had experienced under the monarchy, and they created something instead that was more or less its opposite, a confederal system in which power was too diffuse, too spread out. This produced an opposite set of problems. Too much diffusion of power meant the states thought of themselves as sovereign, independent countries that could do whatever they wanted. And so they did, each having their own military, their own foreign policy, their own currencies, their own trade policies and tariffs. And it meant that they could not provide for their own domestic security, and it also meant that the states could even go to war with each other, which they nearly did. In short, what happened is the founders had miraculously won a war they weren't supposed to win, but now, 15 years later, were losing the peace. And not only was this a dangerous situation, it was embarrassing also. And so they met at Philadelphia in order to revise the Articles of Confederation, and they realized pretty quickly that they had to start over with a fresh approach. And this gives us what we now know as the Constitution. It seems to me quite clearly that the essence of what the founders were attempting in 1787 was to find a sweet spot in which they could avoid their previous lived bad experiences of, first, too much concentration of power under the monarchy, and second, too little concentration of power under the Articles. The founders were now acting as constitutional engineers, and from that perspective, it seems to me that there are three ways in which power can be more or less concentrated. And I'm going to skip a little bit of what I intended to say. I can follow up on this a little bit later if you like. But the essence of what I'm arguing here is that if you're a constitutional engineer and you're trying to find that sweet spot relative to degree of concentration of power, there are kind of three dimensions you can work with. The first I call the societal dimension, and it basically asks the question, how much power are you giving to government in any form versus to the people? And you can give an answer to that question ranging from totalitarianism to anarchy or something in between. The second is what I call the vertical dimension, and that asks the question, how much power do you locate in the hands of the central government versus the units within that society? Of course, in the United States, those units are the 50 states. And once again, there are different answers to that question, a unitary system, a confederal system. In our case, the founders invented a new system called federalism, in which they basically split the difference. But let me focus a little bit more on the third choice that you have, the third dimension of concentration of power. And this is what I refer to as the horizontal dimension. Here, the question is how much power is to be concentrated or spread out within the national government itself. And once again, there are choices, but the two basic models are a parliamentary system, which by and large concentrates enormous power into the hands of the chief executive, usually but not always called the prime minister, excuse me, or the other option, which is the presidential system, or sometimes referred to as the Madisonian model, which does the opposite, spreads power out. This is the system that the founders created, and it brings us back to finally answering the question that our Martian friend is puzzled about, which is why would one ever split one's government apart? And having done so, why would one ever intentionally set those pieces into conflict with each other? The answer, of course, is that the task of the founders in Philadelphia was to create a new political system in which power had to be concentrated more than it was under the Articles, but they were still hugely fearful of creating an autocrat and replicating their very unhappy experience with the king. And so they hedged their bets, in part by creating this Madisonian model. The idea was to take the power of government and to divide it into three functional pieces. So you have a legislative or lawmaking function, and you create an institution for that. You have an executive function to carry out those laws, and you create an institution for that. And you have an adjudicatory function, and you create an institution for that in the judiciary. And what that does then is, of course, it splits power and it sets those three branches of government at war with each other. And on its face, I think, in the abstract, this creates a system of government that is inefficient on a good day and downright dysfunctional at its worst moment, which raises the question once again as to why anyone would ever do it. But now we know the answer. One would do it if they were fearful about concentration of power. So let's ask the question, how did the system work out? How did the founders' scheme work out? And one might be tempted to say quite successfully, in the sense that the United States has had a pretty stable democracy over 250 years now. That's not nothing. And in fact, for a large period of that time, we have been a model for other countries as well. But I think, as always, in any kind of scientific enterprise, we want to resist the urge to equate correlation with causation. In other words, America's success in producing political stability may be a product of the Constitution, but it's also possible that the two are merely coincidental, and the Constitution is not the driving causal factor in our history of relative political stability. In this respect, I would have us return once again to the question of the British system, which I would argue has been more or less equally successful and equally democratic for the last 2+ centuries, and yet which has a much higher degree of concentration of power built into the system. The fact that you have these two very different models that have a relatively equivalent outcome suggests that the thing that is different, in this case separation of powers, is not what is driving that success. Of course, the other salient point I think we need to make about the success of the founders' creation is that whatever original success they might have had in finding the sweet spot between too much and too little concentration of power, that system has actually been unraveling over the last 50 years, or arguably even more than a century. That growing imbalance led Arthur Schlesinger to coin the term the imperial presidency all the way back in 1973 to describe the degree to which the presidency has become so powerful that the institution looked more like an emperor, no longer like the servant and executor of congressional decision-making in a system of checks and balances and separation of powers. Since 1973, I would argue that it's hard to argue that the system has done anything other than to accelerate those tendencies. And we've had presidents like Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush who have vigorously asserted their vision of an increasingly muscular presidency. And now, of course, today, we have a president who has literally claimed that he is constitutionally entitled to do whatever he wants to do. This breakdown of the system is now showing up in every domain of governance, but it's always been most apparent in the question of war powers. And I know my colleague Susan is going to address this, so I'll leave most of this discussion to her. But I want to just note that I think a couple things are going on here, one having to do with basic semantics and one having to do with historical contingency. And what I mean by that is it's pretty clear to me that the founders intended Congress to be the big dog in American government and to be the big policymaker on questions of state, including the decision of whether to go to war or not. The phrasing in the Constitution, however, is problematic. They literally gave Congress the exclusive power to declare war. Now, in the 18th century, that is what gentlemen did when they decided to fight each other. In our time, not so much. Thus, the United States has engaged in a series of protracted, expensive, and bloody wars ranging from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq again, to Afghanistan, to Iran, and beyond, and we've never once declared war since 1941. The war powers domain is the place where this problem of the imperial presidency is most obvious, but it's everywhere. We basically have a first branch of government, the United States Congress, that is today doing essentially nothing. And it is especially doing nothing in the two most significant domains where it was intended by the founders to be the most important branch of government. It's doing nothing when it comes to legislating, and it's doing nothing when it comes to oversight, meaning fulfilling its constitutional mandate to know and control what the executive branch is up to. And this latter point, I think, is especially troubling because we now have the most dangerous and most reckless president and executive branch in all of American history. But his party also controls both houses of Congress, and they are doing nothing to oversee what is happening, nor to check and balance against presidential power and the damage being done. The failure of Congress to fulfill its constitutional role and responsibilities is a real curiosity at first glance. After all, the founders clearly feared the exertion of power by various actors, and what we're seeing in Congress is more or less the exact opposite. At every opportunity, Congress is today not only not seeking power, it's purposely avoiding it and abdicating it from its assigned role in the system. And for that reason alone, we would be in a remarkable development at this time. But it's especially remarkable today if you consider the astonishing actions of the president and the executive branch, which Congress is working so hard to not oversee that it literally stays out of session during various crises. This is a president who has unilaterally destroyed large chunks of congressionally mandated parts of government. This is a president who has sent military forces into our society and killed some of our citizens. This is a president who has launched a war and cannot even manage to offer a clear and coherent lie as to why that war is justified, let alone a valid rationale. This is a president who has threatened to annihilate an entire civilization in one night. This is a man who has been credibly accused by about 24 women of sexual assault and who inadvertently actually admitted that that's exactly what he does on an audio tape. This is a president who has been accused by a victim of raping a child as part of Jeffrey Epstein's criminal enterprise and is refusing to hand over documents related to that case. This is a president who has unilaterally fabricated huge taxes in the form of tariffs, usurping one of the clearest constitutional authorities belonging to Congress. This is a president who has turned the Department of Justice into his own personal law firm and has used it to attack his political adversaries on completely bogus charges. This is a president who has given pardons to criminals in exchange for money, and this is the most financially corrupt president in all of American history. This is a president who has pardoned nearly 1,600 felons who attempted to destroy American democracy on January 6, 2021, which he himself had encouraged them to do. We could go on and on here, but I think you get the point. The founders knew that there would be a person like this, or almost like this, and their specific solution was to separate powers and have institutions check and balance against each other. So why is that not happening? I think it would be tempting to think that the Republican members of Congress have put party over their patriotic duty to the country and their constitutional oaths to office, but ironically, I think that gives them too much credit. What I really think is going on here is we live in a time where far too many people in positions of responsibility don't even care about party or supposed ideological principles. Rather, they are simply willing to destroy anything and everything in order to pursue their career ambitions. What I'm saying here is that we live in a time of cultural failure and moral abdication when it comes to our politics, and that under those conditions, no amount of structural tinkering is likely to have much impact in saving us. And again, let's look at the comparative British experience to confirm this conclusion. I would say, as we have noted previously, that in the UK there is no separation of powers, no checking and balances, and yet British democracy appears no worse off because of those structural choices. The lesson to me is that it is not the architecture of institutions that matter, but the character of those who inhabit them. At the end of the day, in a democracy, we are ultimately stewards of our own government, and the quality of that government is ultimately a reflection of our quality as citizen owners and caretakers. I do want to share with you some thoughts about some tinkering and some changes to the mechanics of our constitutional system that I think would have a positive impact. I probably have taken way too much time already, so I'll save those for later if anybody wants to hear my thoughts on those. But what I do want to conclude with is this thought, which is one that I sort of just articulated, and that is that we can make these changes. We can make a lot of other changes, and they will clearly, I think, have a positive effect. But they might be a lazy solution, and they might really not have much of a positive effect. At the end of the day, it seems to me if we want a healthier country, we have to demand more of our political class. And demanding more of our political class requires demanding more of ourselves. To my mind, the only solution here is for us to become better citizens, more informed, more critically thoughtful, and more genuinely patriotic rather than selfish in our voting choices. I hope we'll do that, and I encourage you to be part of that solution. Thank you.
Thank God for the turn at the end, right? We were all going to die otherwise. But you'll hear that reinforced, I think, in our next two speakers as well. And if you had the good fortune to be in the session before this, you also heard the importance of citizen paying attention and citizen action. So our next speaker is Susan Gottehrer, who's the director of the Nassau County, New York Civil Liberties Union. She's been a lifelong activist and member of the NYCLU since 2006. She's fought for immigration, reproductive and voting rights, as well as police and criminal defense reform. She holds, wait for it, a master's in education from Columbia, a master's in poli-sci from the New School, and a master's in public administration and policy analysis from NYU. What's next, Susan? In addition to her NYCLU work, she is an adjunct political science professor at Pace, Adelphi, and LIU. Susan's going to speak from her seat, and she has generously come in today, but she's having a severe back issue, but came in anyway. So thank you. That's what citizens do. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. Professor Green just blew the doors off my mind, so I'm not exactly sure where to start. But I will say, let me just say one thing so I don't forget it for later. Along the lines of when we vote, we have to know things. And I am a huge fan of trying to get political science college information into high schools. There's a way to do that. We need more civic education. Andrea, we can talk later. But I feel like, I'm sorry. I feel that we don't have enough civic conversation about the actual structure of government. We do a lot of history in high school, but I think we need a little bit more. Anyway, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how the separation of powers actually translates into the work that we do at the ACLU. So the New York Civil Liberties Union, which is me, I work at the state levels and the local levels. So sorry. The ACLU is the national organization, and the New York State affiliate, that's us, is the New York State affiliate. There are affiliates in every state in the union. And so the way that our work sort of translates into this question of separation of powers, where is it in trouble? Is it okay? Is it going somewhere? Is it gone? You know, the work that we do functions within the scope of the separation of powers that the founders set for us. So I'll give you a little bit more of the nitty-gritty about how that work is done, and maybe a hopeful prognosis at the end. I don't know. We're going to see. First of all, when we talk about separation of powers, we're talking about, as Professor Green sort of outlined, I sort of have it in two different buckets. One is the three branches and the checks and balances, and the other is the separation of powers between the federal government and the states. And so let's just first talk about federal versus state levels of government and where they're located in the Constitution. We find in Article 1, Section 9 describes relationships between the states, and Section 10 contains a list of what states cannot do. The 10th Amendment states powers not delegated to the federal government, not prohibited to the states, are reserved for the states, for the people. As we progressed through our history, we can also look to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that then created more federal power by telling the states what they are not allowed to do regarding the end of slavery in those three amendments. So people who look at when did the federal power start to grow also include the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Finally, a case can be made that through the Supreme Court rulings using the Commerce Clause, that's another place where the federal power started to grow over the states. And also you can find it in the 1964 civil rights cases. And then we can also go into separation, the other bucket of separation of powers, which is I'm leaving the judicial branch for my colleague here. I'm going to give you some court cases that the ACLU is diving into, but I'm not going to go into too much detail about the judicial branch. So I'm going to talk about the legislative and executive branches and that separation of power. And that exists at the federal level and the state level and also in your town. The mayor appoints who? And does the mayor have power? In your little towns, this is where you got to keep your eyeballs on, because this is where all the bad stuff is going on, because nobody's watching, just as an aside. So for the legislative branch versus the executive branch, we can look to the end of Article 1, Section 8. By the way, Section 8 is an enumerated list. It's a list of what the Congress can do at the federal level. If you look at the list, if I was feeling better, I would have had constitutions for every single one of you, make you open your book and look at the enumerated list. It's not that long, which is why you hear the Republican Party saying, that's not on the enumerated list. There shouldn't be a department for that in the federal government, right? So just to let you know that, take a look at the enumerated list when you get a chance. At the end of it, there's something called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is also called the Elastic Clause. What it does is it says, well, here's your list of what you have to do, and then this little paragraph that says, whatever you have to do to carry out these laws and functions, go for it. That's why it's called the Elastic Clause, because over the years, through the Supreme Court, the power of the federal government has grown through the use of the Elastic Clause. And also, Congress having the power of the purse is another separation of powers, which we'll get to when we talk about war powers. Senate advise and consent, that's also another separation of powers within the government itself at the federal level. Impeachment is a separation of power as well on the executive branch from the legislative branch. So that being said, I can share some of the work that the ACLU does, but before I do that, I just want to make sure everybody understands what executive orders are. A lot of the power that the Trump administration is exerting, and also, just to be fair, not always the Trump administration. Presidents have used the executive order for many, many years to get around Congress, right? The initial use of the executive order is when Congress passes a law, it can't anticipate every single thing that needs to be done, right? So if you are sitting in the EPA, which is an executive branch agency, Congress passes a law, something about the environment, lands on your desk. You're reading it, and there's a couple of gaps. Like, it doesn't give you full instructions on what to do. So somebody's got to make the decision at that desk, in that executive agency, what is that? What do we do? And executive orders were used to clarify those things. And in some cases controversial, in some cases not. But the presidents over the years, as Professor Green talked about, have learned how to use the executive orders to really circumvent Congress. So given that background on the use of the executive order, when the ACLU goes to court at the federal level, it's going to court on two different things mostly. One is it's saying you're violating the Constitution. That's clear. You're violating an amendment in the Constitution, something in the Constitution. The second thing that sometimes when we go to court, it's about saying that piece of legislation that was passed by Congress, you're violating that. This is all separation of powers, right? Or where there's no law that says you're allowed to do that. So that's legislative, right? So when Elon Musk took the chainsaw to the agencies, those agencies were established by legislative law, right? They were established by law by Congress. And so the court cases that ensued were saying to the executive branch, because Elon Musk was doing it on behalf of the executive branch, you're not allowed to do that because only Congress can, unlegislate this department, right? So when they started to dismantle the Department of Education, Department of Education was established by law by the Congress. The executive is not allowed to say it doesn't exist anymore. So that's an example. Some of the examples of the ACLU court cases. So the deportation of hundreds of people to El Salvador on midnight flights, right? Trump started to call Tren de Aragua a criminal organization, and he started talking about immigrants at the southern border as an invasion. Also, you might remember, if you were old enough to know, that George Bush started calling about what happened on 9/11 and the subsequent actions as the war on terror. Words are very important. When you use the word invasion and war, it will then open up the door legally to the use of war powers and other pieces of legislation that will allow presidents to gain more power. So Trump invoked the Alien and Enemies Act of 1798 to say that that's why we're able to deport these people all to El Salvador, allowing the U.S. presidents, what it does is it allows the U.S. president to detain or deport foreign nationals from a nation with which the U.S. is at war or has initiated an invasion. That's what the act says. That's why he used the word invasion, so that he could count on being able to use that. The ACLU challenged his use of the Enemies Alien Act, which was passed by Congress, saying that simply declaring someone as part of a criminal organization does not meet the threshold to be able to use the Alien Enemies Act. So that's an example of, in the courts, using the courts to say you are violating law, right? Another example is deployment of National Guard into American cities. ACLU has cases challenging Trump's deployment of the National Guard into American cities under the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which says that the military cannot be used for civilian law enforcement. So again, that's an example, going back to separation of powers, how separation of powers that we're able to go into the courts and challenge and say, you are subverting the powers of Congress by your actions. Birthright citizenship is actually located right in the Constitution. So that's an example of a case that the ACLU is doing also to challenge the Trump administration's attempt to remove birthright citizenship. It is located in the 14th Amendment. So that's another example of how we're using that third branch, the judicial branch, to try to challenge the executive branch. Warrantless home entries. ACLU is challenging the use of administrative warrants instead of judicial warrants for ICE to be able to go into people's homes. A judicial warrant has a stamp of a judge on it. It's been through constitutional process, due process. An administrative warrant is what I call a letter to or from Santa Claus. It's just really a piece of paper that the ICE agency, the executive agency, has said, here's a piece of paper, we want this person. Nope. You have to go to the court. And there are questions right now. I think there's a budget hearing with DHS right now in Congress with Tom Homan, and they're talking about funding DHS, which is another example of legislative using the legislature for oversight over an executive agency. State level detention facilities, we have a court case about that. Immigrants retain constitutional rights. And so we're not actually using the concepts of states versus federal on this case. We're using violations of the Constitution, saying 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, and 14th Amendment due process and equal protection. So that court case is based, coming right straight out of the Constitution, but again, using the judicial branch, a co-equal branch, to be able to challenge the executive, which I think is important. How much time do I have? How are we doing?
You're near the end.
Oh my God. Okay. So I'm going to leave a couple of things out. Let me bring it down to the state level, and then I'll do a very quick review of what Professor Green was talking about with the war powers, which really shows up here. First of all, the work that I do in Nassau County and at the state level is a little more confusing to think about when it comes to checks and balances, but we can still do it, right? So, and this is my day to day. So let's take an example of a bill that we're trying to pass called New York for All that will prohibit all local and state law enforcement entities from contracting with ICE. It will also prohibit all agencies at all levels of government inside New York State from sharing information with ICE, which is very, very important. And what this does is you can see this basically is New York State telling the federal agency, we're not going to do this with you. And it's also New York State telling its local levels, this is what you are and are not allowed to do, right? So when you look at separation of powers, this is a really good example of trying to use all of it. In Nassau County, I don't even know what to say. The Nassau County legislature mimics what's going on in Congress right now. Their one party owns the legislature. The county executive is of that party, and they rubber stamp everything that he wants to do, and the Democrats can't get a foothold at all. They can't, there's absolutely nothing for them to do. And there's things like funding being withheld from Democratic spots like Hempstead, where people are drinking poisoned water. That's happening. There are all sorts of laws being passed that curtail free speech in Nassau County. And when it comes to police oversight, we have and the Nassau County Jail, where, by the way, the air conditioning has been on inside the Nassau County Jail since November. Now maybe it might be useful to have it on, but I'm talking through the 0 degrees. And there was almost no place to go with that. I would send emails everywhere to the executive, to the all the legislators, the sheriff, everybody. Can you do something about this? Nothing. So again, does it work, right? I don't know. But that's just examples. And we would need the Public Safety Committee of the legislature in Nassau County is the oversight entity, and they're not doing it. So again, does it work? I'm not gonna give every single example of what went on with the War Powers Act, but the War Powers Act is a really good example, or war powers in general. When you hear the Congress, the Democrats saying we have to pass a War Powers Act, we have to do it, don't be fooled. This has been going on since the beginning and the founding of the country. Slowly but surely, Congress has been giving up, through slippery slopes, its right to declare war, as written in the Constitution. It's very clear. Congress declares war, the president executes it, right? Commander-in-chief executes it. But there are so many things about that that are not clear, like what is an imminent threat? When is there a slippery slope? What do we do if a diplomat has been captured? This happened in, I can't remember which example, but one of the many historical examples. In the bombing, the Greytown bombing in Nicaragua, in the 1868 legislation, a U.S. diplomat was compromised in Nicaragua. So can the president act right away? Or does he have to wait for Congress to say, go get him, right? So there was a Supreme Court answer to that, was the president can use any means necessary, not amounting to acts of war he deems necessary and proper to obtain release, including suspending commercial activity. What's commercial activity, another word for it? Right? And what's it called when we use it as a punishment? Right. So this is the Supreme Court in 1868. Right? So this goes all the way back. Lincoln asked forgiveness and not permission to suspend habeas corpus and to mobilize the militias, right, at the start of the Civil War. Teddy Roosevelt corollary. If there is a general loosening of ties of civilized society, the U.S. might be compelled to intervene. That was 1904. Yeah, so
Susan, you have to.
I know, I'm done. That was it. That was my last one.
Okay.
But and the deterioration of this has been going on since the beginning.
So many, thank you. So many violations. It's hard to stop. I know. Our final speaker on the panel is Theo Liebmann, who's a clinical professor of law here at Hofstra. He's the executive director of the Freedman Institute for the Study of Legal Ethics, and he directs Hofstra's Youth Advocacy Clinic. And he's very involved in ethics. And why do I not have my glasses on? And he's on the New York State Permanent Commission on Justice for Families and serves as special advisor to the American Bar Association Commission on Youth at Risk. He conducts trainings on ethical issues and has written law review articles on how ethical mandates affect the representation of immigrant children and families in state courts, the overlap between child welfare and immigration law, and the impact of family law legal standards on the physical and emotional well-being of youth and children. He also here is the attorney in charge of the Youth Advocacy Clinic, and he and his students have advocated on behalf of hundreds of youth involved in immigration, family, and appellate courts. So thank you very much, Professor Liebmann. Let's see. There we go.
I liked your treat. That was terrific. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you guys. I am going to give you a whirlwind case history and the study of separation of powers, and in particular, the challenges, the deep challenges really, with having an independent judiciary in the way that our separation of powers was set up. Why it's so hard, and today also why we should have hope when we look at how our independent judiciary and court system is responding. So the first thing to think about is the unique challenge, the uniquely powerful role, and the unique vulnerability of the judiciary and branch and the court system in general. On the one hand, the role of the judiciary is incredibly important to our entire constitutional democracy, and that the Supreme Court has the last word on whether the rules, the laws in our country pass constitutional muster. That's an incredibly powerful role for the judiciary to have. On the other hand, and the framers recognized this, the judiciary branch is uniquely vulnerable because it has neither the power of the purse nor the power of the sword, meaning that they don't control any kind of monetary impetus to make people follow their decisions, and they don't control any kind of military force to compel that their decisions be followed. And so that creates a real challenge. Now, long before we are in current times where the judiciary is being challenged, the fourth Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which was John Marshall, realized that this was a real unique vulnerability that the court had. And so he did something very clever in this famous case of Marbury versus Madison. And you can see up there some of the language that's in it, really emphatically endorsing the power of the judicial department here. But the reason that this decision has held up so well is because he did it in the context of saying exactly what you see up here, that we have the power to say what the law is. And what we're going to say the law is here is that we actually don't have jurisdiction to make this decision. And the decision was President Adams had appointed some judges at the very end of his tenure. And when Jefferson came in, he told his Secretary of State, who was James Madison, not to bring over what's called commissions, not to actually deliver to the judges that John Adams had appointed this piece of paper saying, yes, you're really judges. And one of those judges, probably all of them, they were all very upset, but one of them was this guy Marbury, and he said, no, I'm going to court, and I want you, court, to tell Jefferson and Madison they have to give me that piece of paper that makes me a judge. And so what Marshall did here is he said, we have the power to decide what the law is, but in this particular case, what we can see is what the law says here is that Congress gets to decide if these pieces of paper get delivered, and therefore we're not going to decide. And that way, Jefferson didn't challenge the decision, and so now you had this case out there that said exactly what you see up there. We, the judiciary, get to decide what the law is. Really very clever. As Susan referenced, since then, there has been very little executive defiance of court. actually Abraham Lincoln did defy the court. Habeas corpus, he wanted it suspended. The court said, no, you can't suspend habeas corpus, which means anytime someone is detained, they have a right to contest that detention. And he said, it's the beginning of the Civil War. There's this guy, Merriman, who's in Baltimore, who's helping out the Confederate troops. I don't want him to have a trial. I just want to detain him. And the court said, you can't do it. And he did it anyway. Obviously, that was a long time. And the other case, Worcester versus Georgia, that's President Jackson there, who was told he was not allowed to send troops into Georgia and drive the Cherokee Nation out of Georgia. He ignored that, which is what led to the Trail of Tears, which maybe many of you learned about in history class. But so really, that's about it. That's about it in terms of executive defiance of judicial orders until now. And now what we have are attacks on the judiciary system, on the independence of courts, and really on lawyer independence in general since the start, really, of the second Trump administration. There was some of it in the first Trump administration, but it really has kicked up now. There has been an incredible uptick of intimidation of judges. There has been incredible uptick in the weaponization of the Department of Justice and threats to lawyer independence. Trump himself has called judges who rule against him, and these are quotes from his posts on Truth Social and his speeches. He's called them monsters. He's talking about federal court judges here. Monsters, lunatics, crooked, and the radical left. The quote you can see up there, actually, can you see it? No. There's a quote from Stephen Miller, who's his primary advisor, saying that judges are involved in a legal insurrection against the United States. There have been personal attacks. Trump has called justices unpatriotic and disloyal, including his own appointees. He's called them an embarrassment to their families, threatened to impeach them. The consequences have really been pretty severe. There's been a dramatic increase in threats to the security of judges, harassment of their families, and judges have reported extreme levels of pressure and safety concerns. In terms of the Department of Justice is the lawyer for the people of the United States. And Trump has done everything he can to remake that into his personal lawyer. And that is unprecedented and also extremely damaging to the judicial branch and to the court system in general. His appointees have been chosen because of their loyalty to causes, personal causes that he has, including, as was referenced, I think, by David, including attacks, investigations into his rivals. We're all different. The facts are the same. How you look at it, and I'll talk about this in a minute as well, how you look at it is up to you. It's up to us how we look at it. So one way of looking at that is horrific and potentially something that is going to crush our constitutional democracy as we have it. Another way of looking at that is looking at what the grand juries did in every single one of those cases where he has brought a personal attack on a rival, a grand jury, which is made of people like us, that the Department of Justice has to go and say, hey, we want you to indict this person. They've refused to indict. So that's the power of the people. That's what gives us hope, that we are able to do those things. Voting is the most important, but we also serve on grand juries, and we're able to push back in ways like that. And then the third bucket I have here, threats to lawyer independence. Many of you may remember that at the beginning of his administration, Trump issued a whole bunch of these executive orders basically saying that these law firms, you maybe can guess, but I'll tell you in a minute why they were targeted. These specific law firms no longer have any kind of clearance on a federal level. And these were law firms who were representing individuals who had business in federal courts, before federal agencies, sometimes even before the Senate. And these executive orders said these people no longer have clearance to come and do their job. They were targeted based on whether there were members of those law firms who had been involved in any way in prosecuting January 6 cases, in his impeachment, anything like that, and whether they were law firms that had any kind of DEI policies. And that's how he decided which law firms to say, we're going to revoke their clearance. Again, to the positive aspect of this, those law firms at the district court level have won every single case who were targeted. The ones who haven't won are the ones who didn't fight. An important lesson there. The ones who haven't won are the ones who didn't fight and didn't push back. Those law firms decided to capitulate and sign agreements with Trump saying, we agree we will get rid of our DEI. We agree that we will only take pro bono cases of this certain type that you approve or that you've told us we're allowed to do. So those law firms are stuck with those agreements. The ones who fought and won in court show that there is value in pushing back. And I want to talk a little bit now about some of this pushback. So I'm going to read this quote to you. The reason I'm going to read it to you is because this is a Trump-appointed judge. This is a Trump-appointed judge who is one of the hundreds of judges around the country who is pushing back on the illegal detentions of immigrants around the country. More than 30,000 immigrants are being detained under new unconstitutional policies that this administration has put in place. And advocates like the ACLU, like our clinics, like many advocacy organizations around the country are pushing back and saying you're not allowed to do this, and are taking these cases into the federal court system, that independent judiciary, and are saying that this isn't legal. Right now, it's about 300 judges have all said that these kinds of detentions are illegal, and there's about 12 who have said that they are legal. Here's the quote from this Trump appointee judge who was handling one of these cases in the Eastern District of New York. This isn't how things are supposed to work in America. Unquestionably, the laws of human decency condemn such villainy. Equally, the laws of this nation, including the Constitution, statutory law, and regulations, prescribe the illegal arrest and detention of the petitioner as well as the retaliatory termination without notice of the privileges associated with his SIJ status, which is a kind of humanitarian immigration relief. While the executive branch retains the right, as it has done, to set policy regarding immigration matters, it is forbidden from trampling our system of laws, a system which has safeguarded this nation for close to 250 years. So, pushback. That is the pushback that you get from this independent judiciary. And right now, the court system and the advocates who advocate there are, and this maybe plays into your assessment that things are looking particularly grim, they're kind of one of the last available arenas for this pushback to happen, other than being a public citizen, which you've heard referenced by both of the previous speakers. If any of you go to law school, one of the ethical obligations that is written into the lawyer's ethical code is that you have a responsibility to aspire to be a good public citizen. And the first quote up here is directly from those rules. To further the public's understanding of and confidence in the rule of law, to support the justice system because legal institutions in a constitutional democracy depend on popular participation and support. The other two things are things that I added. Mobilize federal, state, and local government actors to implement rulings and vote. These are a bunch of, you don't need to know these specific websites, but there are a number of websites out over there that you can use to really stay informed about what's going on, which is incredibly important. Making your voice heard, call your elected representatives, inform others, join together. That little crystal-y thing up there is a close-up of a piece of sand. If you think that our country is going in the wrong direction and the wheels are turning that way, be a piece of sand. Enough pieces of sand and we slow it down. And what will happen is we will have a new election. We will have an election in 2.5 years. We will have a presidential election when this administration is over. Those things are going to happen. So the more, if you don't like the way this country is moving right now in terms of our separation of powers, the more little grains of sand there are pushing back, the more likely that we'll still be standing when the time comes. I'll stop there, and because I really want to hear all of your questions.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm sure what you heard out of everybody is the power of the citizen, and the citizen is highest office of the land, in effect, really. Just one addition to what you just heard, which is we don't just have an election in 2.5 years. We have an election very soon. We have it in the state offices. We have it in national offices. And if you're thinking that, well, if there's still somebody acting king-like, that's not going to make any difference. Au contraire, we heard about the power of investigation and oversight. In fact, changing what the balance of power is in Congress changes oversight immediately. This election matters, the one coming up, not just the one 2.5 years from now. And not everybody always pays attention to those, so make sure you're registered and vote in whatever way makes sense to you, but do your information, your homework. So this is the moment when people should gather at the microphones, and the reason you gather at a microphone is because we're recording this, so that's why we do it from there. So students obviously get preference. Here we are at Hofstra. You're paying tuition. You should get the first comments. But please jump up and ask a question of any nature based on what you heard. You heard a lot, so I understand that's kind of overwhelming for a moment. As you gather your thoughts to do it, I know that I have one question I want to ask, but I'm going to wait and see if people come up first. So this is your moment. Great. I'll hold my question.
For Professor Green, you mentioned something about tinkerings for the constitutional mechanisms. I was curious if you could expand on what the ideas you had.
Oh, thanks. Good to see you, by the way. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'm looking around at the institutions that did best, I think, in this period of what I would describe as a full-blown constitutional and democracy crisis. I think those tended to be more technocratic institutions than those that were shielded from public opinion by long terms in office. So in particular, I think the Federal Reserve Bank did pretty well in standing up to this kind of autocratic tendency of our current president. I think the lower courts in the federal judiciary did well. So using that concept as a model, I wonder if there aren't chunks of the executive branch that we've traditionally put in this pyramid under the control of the president that we couldn't move at least partially, if not entirely, out of that branch, in effect creating a fourth or a fifth branch of government, if you will, or you can label it in different ways. But for example, the one that jumps to mind especially is the Department of Justice. I don't think very much of the Department of Justice's work is political or policy-wise, policy-oriented in nature, or at least those parts that aren't. I don't think those should be under the control of a partisan in the same way that we have the Federal Reserve, because we don't want monetary policy to be under the control of a partisan political figure. I'd like to see a lot more empowerment of minority parties in Congress. I think we could solve a lot of problems if you didn't need a majority to bring legislation to a vote, or to hold hearings, or to go to Andrea's point that she just made, to subpoena witnesses and documents, all of which is essentially being blocked right now by very, very narrow majorities in both houses of Congress. I'd also like to see a lot more teeth put into the repercussions and consequences attached to individuals who refuse to testify to Congress or who lie when they're giving sworn testimony. I think if we brought the hammer down on those people, we'd get much better outcomes. I'd like to see a lot more of that testimony, congressional oversight testimony, pursued publicly and done in a fashion that was really about getting at the truth rather than about congressional showboating. On the question of war powers, I think we need to move to some clear and emphatic language. So we definitely need to give the president, I think, as the commander-in-chief, the power to act, to deploy forces for a brief period of time, and solely in the situation of a bona fide emergency. I think, clearly that's something that has to exist. But apart from that, we should make clear with revised constitutional language, if necessary, that only Congress has the power to make these decisions. I I think our federal judiciary actually has become way too powerful. We might disagree on this, Theo, but it effectively now functions as an unelected mini legislative branch, and it makes policy decision after policy decision in America. And in a true democracy, you can't have that. Policy decisions have to be made by democratically elected institutions, and that's not what our judiciary is. So I would advocate for diminishing the judicial branch's power. This is the power that's called judicial review, or some people refer to as legislating from the bench for good reason, making policy choices on immigration or abortion or even healthcare. And this would also force Congress to do its job instead of hiding behind the robes of the judiciary. So those are some things, but I guess I want to emphasize again, I think these could be consequential changes, but they're sort of tinkering. I think, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, if you will. Not that we're necessarily a sinking ship. My point is there's a greater solution, and that is we as owners of our democracy, we're amongst the luckiest people in all of human history to actually have democracy and to be able to own our government. And we're blowing it because we're not taking care of it. Only barely half of us even vote, and that's sort of like showing up once every 4 years, cast a ballot and walk home. And we need to pay a lot more attention to it. We need to be, as I said in my talk, we need to be much more critical consumers of information and much more active and much more demanding of our political leaders.
And just to piggyback on that last comment for 1 second, when Ta-Nehisi Coates came and spoke here, he gave Americans a C for voting. He said the grade I give you is a C. Like, voting is average. Like, that's the bare minimum you could be doing. But people aren't even doing that. I mean, it's a C. And then think of what you need to do beyond that. Please.
Hi, I just want to say, first of all, thank you all so much for the vital work that you are doing. I think that I am one of many people, especially my age, that feels a very deep conflict between wanting to believe in the power of the courts to do good by, I'm going to start crying, sorry. I really want to believe that a better future is possible. And we've seen really difficult things go through our country in the past, with slavery and segregation, and we got past that. It feels different today. And I guess I want to know if you guys think that that's just because I'm living through it right now, like how heavy and inescapable it feels, or if there really is something that can happen from these rulings saying that what ICE is doing is unconstitutional, because every day people are still getting kidnapped, people are still getting shipped to prisons, families are being destroyed, children are having the most important years of their lives stolen from them. And it's really hard not to feel hopeless. Thank you.
Yeah. The work is extremely difficult. Keeping hope is extremely difficult. I do think I wasn't obviously alive in previous difficult times, but I do believe that these are our most challenging times right now since the Civil War. Maybe the history professors here can correct me on that, but that is how I feel. The hope, I can tell you what I do for hope. The hope I get is every time you can help another individual in a time like this, you have changed a universe. And the country around us may be still grinding slowly towards an autocracy. Horrible things are definitely still happening. But when you can change the life of one person, which is why I love the law, and we have gotten some of our clients out of detention, when that client of ours comes to our office and is beyond thrilled to be reunited with his family and to have his life back, that gives purpose, and that drives the hope that if we do that, it's the grain of sand, right? If we keep doing that, if we keep pushing back, I'm not saying that there's no despair, especially doing this kind of work for immigrants. There's despair every day. But there's also hope every day. And being inspired by the people you're helping, being inspired by the people who you're working with, and hoping that we can get through it. Because if you don't do those things, and if you don't hope, we're definitely done. And by the way, that's also, I'll let you guys talk in a second, that's also not to say that you're wrong to have despair. That, of course, share it with other people. Maybe spread it around a little bit, but share it with other people, and work together, sort of to fight that. If you're in that world where you're fighting every day for that, or you're thinking about it every day, give yourself a break. Find other things that you can do. Reading books that have nothing to do with politics. Going for a run if that's your thing. Whatever it is. I know that's all a little scattershot all over the place, but I feel what you're saying.
I would add to that all of this is very complicated, and there are, it does feel like this is different because there is lawlessness going on and a deterioration of our institutions and a consolidation of power that has happened legally and has been taken advantage of and caused by an electorate that doesn't know things. Again, back to social studies education, and media propaganda systems that allow for the dehumanization of people. The only way you can treat people the way we're treating people right now is if you spent a huge amount of time dehumanizing them in an amp up. So whatever media you're watching, whatever social media you're doing, when you see anybody putting anybody else down, I don't care which side you're on, reject it and go find a different source. No joke. Okay? The right has things to say about the left. The left has plenty of demeaning things to say about the right. Just reject it. Go find somebody who has a different life experience than you do and go find out where they're coming from. And also ask them what news organization they're watching. Really, seriously, no joke. There's lies going on, coming out through the media. So that's why this all feels so bad. But don't allow any of yourselves to be dehumanized. Don't watch anything that's dehumanizing any other group of people unless you go find out about it. And even if you do find out about it, don't you dehumanize. That's why this stuff is happening. So also, if you're interested in taking any action, you come see me afterwards. We have action that makes you feel better. So.
I just add one quick point, and then we'll hear from our other two students who are at the mics. It is overwhelming, so you're right to feel you're right to feel as you feel. I think we all agree to that. But in the last session, my colleague Linda Longmire talked about having political fitness, and I think of it even more concretely, which actually in the ACLU newsletter I used to write a column, and it was called the 5-minute test. That at the end of the day, every day, and it could just be weekdays if you want, you don't have to do it on the weekends, like take the 5-minute test. What did you do today? 5 minutes, that's all. That might be calling Congress. It might be talking to a family member who's challenging on these issues. Whatever it is, what are the things you did that day? 5 minutes, that's all doable for us who are all overcommitted to change things. And the other piece of that, I think, that Theo was referring to is being involved in a group in some way. Doing this on your own is too horrible and overwhelming. Being involved in a group means you have compadres, and that's important. Please, next question.
So my question is pretty straightforward, but it's also it's very important. Do you guys think that Trump is a fascist? Because my answer would be yes, but obviously you guys are the experts, and I'm interested to hear what you think.
And before my colleagues answer that, let's take the final question as well, so we'll see what the two last questions are, so you both get heard.
Right.
So my question is, it's a bit of a loaded one, so sorry. Can Congress ever hope to regain anything close to its governmental power intended by the founders, or has that ship sailed since the imperial presidency began?
Okay, so those two kind of go together, I think.
Can you repeat the last one really quick?
Can regain its power.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, I got it.
The
Yeah.
last part, or just everything
Thank
from?
you.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Can it ever regain its intended power as intended by the founders, Congress?
Okay.
Or has that ship sailed, them getting more power, or rather the power that they once had ever since the start of the imperial presidency in like the 1940s?
Ooh, now everyone has
here we go.
questions when we have 4
Extend?
seconds
Can we
left.
extend?
Can we hear your final 2 questions, and then we'll somehow weave it all together? We don't know how. Go.
Should I go? Okay. My question is just kind of pertaining to Dr. Libresco and my fellow teachers in the room. But as future teachers, this is a lot to kind of stay, connected with and stay on top of. How do you think that we should help keep our students informed, and also, at what point does not talking about these issues, because I know sometimes in the classroom it can kind of get hard what to talk about and what not to. At what point does not talking with them cross the line from protecting them to neglecting to inform them?
Okay, and final question? And then, I don't know how they'll all go together, but they will.
I was just going to say, how can we as residents of Nassau County, especially those from Uniondale and Hempstead, better inform our community and speak out about local issues like the water contamination that was mentioned and the increased enforcement activities such as ICE, and speaking of which, as future educators, having these people come to schools is just terrifying, and it's devastating, honestly. And I just want to see how can we as future educators and just students in general just speak out about that and to inform our community to keep people aware, protected, and able to advocate for themselves.
So I'm going to, at the very end, answer the education thing in 3 sentences. So I give it to my other colleagues to talk about the fascism and is there any hope for Congress question.
I'll take those 2 questions, or I'll give
Go
you
for it.
my answer.
I may want to answer
Yes,
whatever.
would
I
love
don't
to
know what
hear
he's
from you
going to
guys.
say.
On the fascism question, I don't mean to be mealy-mouthed about this, but it really depends on how you define it. And just to give you an example, Italian fascism, which is the original fascism, was different from German fascism. In particular, the Italian version was lacking the anti-Semitic vibe that you got from Hitler's version, right? So I'll say this. If you define fascism as autocratic rule, the demolishment of democratic institutions, the use of bigotry in order to gain public support for your movement, and militarized actions against other countries, then I think Trump would meet that definition. If you define it otherwise, maybe not so. I mean, I guess I'm comfortable just calling him an autocrat or a would-be autocrat, an aspiring autocrat. I'm not sure we have to go further to say fascism or not. On the question of Congress, if they want the power, it's there for the taking, and cross your fingers, you may see that happen in January. I think there's going to be a bloodletting in November. I think you're going to see an unbelievable political landslide. For sure, I think the House of Representatives is going to be in the hands of the Democrats. Not that I have very much faith in them, because I don't. But I think their base may make some pretty big demands on them, and so you may begin to see some real give and take and some real congressional, at least in the House, maybe in the Senate as well, some real congressional activity when the new Congress starts in the beginning of January.
Yeah, I would agree. There's a lot written about fascism, and it takes a lot of different forms. So I would encourage everybody to maybe do a little bit of a dive into that to see what it is. I would say this administration is a combination of there's extortion, corruption, there's a mafia feel to some of it, there's lawlessness, and there's consolidation of power. Legally. So I don't even know, what do you call that? There's lots of different names.
Kakistocracy, which is...
Yeah, there's a lot of different names you can call that, but I think it's a combination of a lot of different things. I also just want to say that when it comes to Congress, there are many factions in Congress, which goes to the parliamentary question. Any other wing of one of the two parties has to get subsumed into that institution, because every structure in that institution is only set up for two. It's only set up for a binary. So I know that there are a lot of young people out there that are either very far right or very far left, and there's no home for them, which then makes you stay away from the polls, because both mainstream parts of those parties look corrupt. Or same thing, who cares, right? You're not changing anything for me. Don't forget, this also has to do with the capitalist system and the political system and how it works together, and there's a lot of disaffection. So think about this, but if you continue to not vote, we might lose it. So I am on the side of trying to figure out a home for all of these voices, and I'm just praying that all of the disaffected voices don't just disappear, because we need them. So.
And I'll answer the education question, which actually applies to all citizens, and this is the final thing, and then I'll thank our panelists. One thing I'd add is, with this wave election, a person who's a big autocrat in Eastern Europe was just defeated as well, by a lot. So that corruption issue plays well, as it turns out. So with respect to educators, but citizens, is what I'd say is, I think for all of us, it means that we have to exhibit these things ourselves. So we have to exhibit being informed citizens. This is for normal citizens, too, that you talk to people about what you read, that you tell your students what you read that day and where you found it and why it was reliable, because it has to be a reliable source that you're talking about. That you, in your classrooms, have space for discussions about issues. We always have space for discussions about the weather. Like, everybody's always doing the weather in their classroom, in kindergarten stuff. Why aren't we having space for discussions throughout our classes for these issues on a regular basis? As people who are community members here, because I see some of those in the room too, community members have a responsibility to call up schools and say, what are you doing about civics? What are you doing about social studies? I don't hear much coming home. We hear a lot when people don't like what's going on, say, oh, take that book out. But the other people stay silent often about that they would like these things discussed. I hear plenty of people who are secondary social studies teachers who are afraid. One of my students said he was afraid to talk about checks and balances and separation of powers in his U.S. history class. Yikes. So that can't be what's going on. We can't be afraid to talk about issues. We have to do them in age-appropriate ways. But as community members and citizens, we need to ask our school districts, what's going on with this? Why are you cutting that test? Why are you cutting that budget? Let's be talking about these issues. Where's the money for these issues coming from? So I think all of those things matter. But at the very least, the 5-minute test, everyone. 5 minutes before you go to bed tonight. What did you do to change a situation you think is problematic? Thank you all for coming. Some of you can stay for the next session, which starts at 2:40, which will focus on immigration at the 250th anniversary. Thank you very much. Thanks to our speakers.